Hello, I'm Dr. Edward Smink, coach, author, and speaker. I have over 40 years of experience in healthcare. I started as a nursing assistant, got my associate's degree in nursing, and then I did pastoral counseling and eventually executive leadership. In 1994, I decided I wanted to get my master's in counseling psychology, and I graduated in 1996. But I always wanted to learn more, and I always wanted to come back to Pacifica. And so I did in the early 2000s, and I graduated with my PhD in depth psychology in 2010, defending my dissertation, Thresholds of Affliction, the Healing Journey of Healing. I was always interested in what goes on in a person when they experience illness. What are the inner strengths that they rely on, and how do they cope? But then I began to understand more fully, what about the caregiver? I've been a caregiver all my life, and I wanted to know what was I experiencing? What were others experiencing? So I began to reflect on how can I adapt my dissertation to a book, but it was always something outside myself. Until early in 2017, I began to do some really interior work. And all of a sudden, in June, I sat down and I said, it's time to write. It wasn't something that someone said, get that book done. And I wrote the 10 chapters, the outline, and I finished it in February of 2018. And it's called The Soul of Caregiving, a caregiver's guide to healing and transformation. Again, I go back to that principle. What do caregivers rely on? And how do they cope with the tremendous difficulties and tensions that they experience in healthcare? But I also broaden the concept of caregiving. We tend to think it's just for those in the healing professions. But I said, what about the first responders? What about police officers, or firefighters, educators? We're all caregivers. For at the heart of being human is the capacity to care. And when we care, we reach out and build relationships. So in my book, it's not a how-to-do book, but it's a book to reflect on your experiences. We all are caregivers, parents who care for their children, also adult children who care for their parents. And I have noticed that the biggest difficulty with caregivers in general is that they don't take time to care for themselves. The same skills they use to help others can be used to help themselves. I had a client who was complaining that she was just exhausted taking care of her father with Alzheimer's. And she said, I wish I had help. So I simply asked, is there someone in your family or in your church that can help you? And she said, well, my husband wants to help. And I said, well, why don't you ask him? And then she realized that she had a control issue in caring for her father. So once she was able to sort that out, she was able to ask help from her husband. So what is the soul of caregiving about? Well, the first chapter talks about the dance of caregiving. Simply put, it means what is the tension that most caregivers feel in relationship to I need to take care of others versus I need to take care of myself. And I sort of want to look at what are the cultural tensions, the taboos that prevent a client or a caregiver to take care of themselves. Maybe they feel shameful. Maybe they'll be ridiculed by their peers. I once interviewed a first responder, and she belonged to a group. It was a voluntary group to debrief from traumatic events. And when she was involved in this, people from her own team called it the Crybabies Club. So right there's a cultural taboo to share your feelings. Well, when you experience traumatic events, it does have an effect on you. Think of situations in your own life where you experience something traumatic or a traumatic event with a friend. It affected you. And so what do you do with those feelings? So that's the first chapter. Then I want to talk about soul. What is soul? And my definition of soul is that life principle within you, those interior resources that you cling to and that you're able to make appropriate decisions. Again, because caregivers are so rushed, they don't stop, they don't pause. And because they don't pause, they don't listen to their soul. They don't listen to the promptings. Michael Kearney calls that soul pain, but eventually the soul pain will arise and you have to deal with it. So reflection is an important aspect of caregiving, pausing and stop and allowing yourself to listen to what's going on. I also talk about the archetype of the wounded healer. The ancients had a wonderful understanding that they were not gods, but that they in themselves were wounded. A lot of caregivers, and we might have had this experience, especially with physicians or captains of police officers or firefighters thinking that they're God. Well, they're not God. They do godly things. See, we all are involved in this sacred work of caregiving. So we're not gods. And so there's a woundedness in us. And when we recognize that, Hillman says, when we experience afflictions, we go deeper and we experience the gods, that sacred part within us. So thank you for this opportunity to share my book. I hope you will use it as a resource to help you be a better caregiver and lead you to healing and transformation. Thank you. It's Dr. Edward Smink.